The machine said he was a corpse, but the child heard him screaming in the silence. Every neurologist at Metropolitan Medical Center had already turned their backs on the man in room 402. Jang Seok-Hyun, the formidable architect of a multi-billion-dollar syndicate, was a fallen king reduced to a breathing body. 3 weeks after an internal coup left 3 bullets in his chest, the monitors displayed nothing but the flat, mechanical rhythm of a failing heart. His brain activity had vanished, his broad shoulders were slumped into the sterile white sheets, and his second-in-command had already signed the final documents to terminate life support in 48 hours. Outside the door, the wolves of the underworld were already carving up his empire, and not a single visitor came out of loyalty, only to verify that the man they once feared was truly finished. But every night, a weary nurse's aide named Maya would wheel her cart into the ICU and do something the doctors found useless. She didn't just check the IV lines. She brought her 6-year-old daughter, Amara, a child who looked at the world with eyes that saw beyond the physical. Maya was barely holding her own life together. A black woman fleeing a cycle of systemic hardship, she was working double shifts to keep a roof over their heads, hiding Amara in break rooms because she couldn't afford childcare. She had every reason to be invisible, to do her job and stay silent in a world that had already tried to break her. But Amara saw something the specialists missed. While Maya cleaned the cold chrome of the monitors, the little girl would gravitate toward the bed. She didn't see a mafia boss or a criminal kingpin. She saw a man whose soul was shivering in the dark. Without a word, Amara would reach out her deep brown hand, wrapping her small, warm fingers around Seok-Hyun's frozen ones. While the world waited for him to die, Amara would whisper to him about the drawings she made in school, the way the streetlights looked like stars, and her promise that she wouldn't let him be lonely. She chose courage over finality, anchoring a man who had been abandoned by power, but not by humanity. The clinical hum of the ICU was the only sound that dared to challenge the heavy silence of room 402. Jang Seok-Hyun, a man who once moved markets with a nod and silenced rivals with a glance, now lay pinned to a mattress by tubes and wires. His broad-shouldered frame, built from decades of disciplined aggression, seemed to be receding into the sterile white linens. To the world outside, he was no longer the apex predator of the soul-integrated syndicates. He was a fallen king, a breathing monument to the finality of a well-placed betrayal. His skin, once a vibrant light medium gold, had turned the color of damp parchment. Disheveled dark hair fell across a forehead that no longer creased with the burden of command. Stripped of his tailored silk suits and the luxury watch that counted his minutes in millions, Seok-Hyun was reduced to a plain hospital gown and the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen tube. Power had been replaced by a fragile, terrifying vulnerability. The lines around his closed eyes, carved by a hard-lived life, now looked like cracks in a porcelain mask that was moments away from shattering. But the real danger wasn't the failing of his organs. It was the hunger of the men packing the corridor outside. Behind the heavy glass doors, the wolves had already stopped mourning. His second-in-command, a man Seok-Hyun had pulled from the gutters of Incheon, stood in the hallway checking a gold timepiece, Seok-Hyun's timepiece, counting down the 48 hours until the legal paperwork would allow him to inherit the throne. These were not men of grief. They were accountants of death, calculating the value of Seok-Hyun's shipping routes and digital keys before his body was even cold. They spoke in hushed tones about succession and territory, their shadows stretching long and dark across the threshold of his room. To them, Seok-Hyun was already a ghost, a logistical hurdle that would be cleared by the pull of a plug. They didn't see a man, they saw a vacancy. They didn't realize that in the deep, terrifying dark of his locked-in mind, the king was still there, screaming into a void that no one could hear. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, listening to the footsteps of the traitors, waiting for the end in a room filled with people who only loved his power, and never the man. He was alone, drifting in the freezing current of his own mortality, until the heavy door creaked open not for a doctor or a killer, but for a woman with a cleaning cart and a child who didn't know how to be afraid. The heavy door of room 402 creaked open with a rhythmic groan that signaled the arrival of the night shift's ghosts. Maya pushed her cleaning cart forward, her movements mechanical and weary, her eyes fixed on the floor to avoid the terrifying stillness of the man in the bed. "Stay by the cart, Amara," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the clinical silence. "Don't touch anything. Don't make a sound. We aren't even here." But Amara, whose world was built of colors and feelings rather than ledgers and bullets, didn't hear the fear in her mother's voice. She only felt the cold. To her, the room didn't smell of antiseptic and impending death. It smelled of a deep, lonely winter. She watched her mother move toward the far corner to scrub the monitors, and then she turned her gaze toward the bed. Jang Seok-Hyun looked like a mountain that had been leveled by a storm. Amara stepped closer, her small, teal-colored top alone spark of life against the shadows. She reached the edge of the high hospital bed and looked up. The man's hand lay atop the white sheet, large, pale, and motionless. To the doctors, it was a piece of failing machinery. To Amara, it looked like a bird with a broken wing, shivering in the frost. Ignoring her mother's strict instructions, Amara reached out. Her deep brown skin was a stark, warm contrast against his porcelain-pale arm. Slowly, with a focus that furrowed her young brows, she wrapped both of her small hands around his. The contact was a shock of heat against the absolute zero of Seok-Hyun's skin. Amara didn't pull away. She leaned in, her round cheeks glowing in the soft light of the heart monitor. "You're too cold," she breathed so softly it was almost a thought. "But it's okay. I'm warm. I'll stay until the sun comes back." Deep within the lightless vault of his own mind, Seok-Hyun felt it. For weeks, he had been drifting in a sensory vacuum, a black ocean where the voices of his enemies reached him only as muffled, distant thunder. He had been preparing to let go, to sink into the quiet. But then, a spark ignited. It wasn't the sharp pain of a needle or the cold pressure of a blood pressure cuff. It was a localized sun, a radiating heat that began at his knuckles and surged toward his heart. He fought through the paralysis, clawing at the walls of his own consciousness. He reached for that heat like a drowning man reaching for a rope. He didn't have the strength to open his eyes or draw a full breath, but he poured every ounce of his fatting will into a single point. Underneath Amara's small, protective grip, Seok-Hyun's thumb gave a sudden, microscopic twitch. Amara's eyes widened, her lips pressing together in a silent gasp of wonder. She didn't scream for her mother. She didn't call for the doctors who had already signed his death warrant. She simply tightened her hold, her small frame leaning further toward him, anchoring the fallen king to the world of the living. She felt the twitch again, a rhythmic, desperate pulse of life responding to her touch. "I see you," she whispered, her expressive eyes focused on his still face. "I'm not letting go." Outside, the wolves continued to check their watches, unaware that a 6-year-old girl had just started a fire in the middle of their winter. The darkness was absolute, a cold, suffocating weight that felt less like sleep and more like being buried alive. For weeks, Jang Seok-Hyun had been a consciousness without a tether, drifting through a void where time had no meaning. He had heard the vultures, his underboss, his rivals, the clinical pronouncements of doctors who spoke of his brain as if it were a burnt-out circuit. He had tried to scream, to lash out at the betrayers, but his body was a tomb of lead and ice. He had reached the edge of the abyss, ready to stop fighting, ready to let the silence win. Then came the warmth. It started as a faint prickle against the frozen wasteland of his skin, a small, radiating sun that refused to be extinguished. It was the first thing in this new, broken world that didn't feel like a threat. And then, breaking through the mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the distant, rhythmic beep of his failing heart, came a sound. It was a low, melodic vibration, humming through the air and settling into the marrow of his bones. A lullaby. It was simple, sweet, and entirely out of place in a room meant for dying. It wasn't the practiced grief of his associates or the weary jargon of the nurses. It was the sound of someone who believed he was still there. "Who are you?" Seok-Hyun's mind clawed at the darkness. "Why are you holding on?" Every note of the humming acted like a needle stitching his soul back into his flesh. He began to perceive the world in jagged fragments. He felt the soft, rhythmic pressure of the child's breath against his arm. He felt the weight of her small, firm grip, a tiny anchor preventing him from being swept away by the black current. For the first time since the bullets tore through his chest, the rage that had fueled his locked-in ghost began to transform into something else. Curiosity. a strange, terrifying flicker of hope. He realized then that the girl was his only shield. If the men outside knew he was returning, they would finish what they started before he could draw a full breath. He had to be a shadow. He had to play the part of the corpse they expected while he mapped the extent of his ruin. He focused every ounce of his burgeoning will on that small, warm hand. He couldn't open his eyes yet. The light would be a betrayal. He couldn't speak. The machines would alert the ward. But as the girl continued to hum, her voice a soft tether in the gloom, Seok-Hyun made a silent vow. He was a man who had built an empire on blood and fear, a man who had never received a gift he didn't pay for. Yet here, in the middle of his own funeral, a stranger was giving him the world for free. "Stay," he pleaded in the silence of his mind, his thumb twitching once more against her palm. "Don't let them pull me back into the dark." He was no longer just a fallen king waiting for the end. He was a predator waking up in the tall grass, hidden by the innocence of a child. The wolves thought they were waiting for a heart to stop, but because of the warmth of a little girl's hand, Jang Seok-Hyun was learning how to live again, and this time he was listening to everything. The sanctuary of the lullaby was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of polished leather boots echoing in the corridor. Maya froze, her heart leaping into her throat as the shadow of a large man darkened the frosted glass of the door. "Amara, now!" she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. She grabbed her daughter's shoulders, moving with a frantic speed born of pure survival instinct. There was no time to reach the hallway. She shoved Amara into the narrow, steel supply closet tucked behind the ventilator, pressing a finger to her own lips. "Not a sound, baby. Don't even breathe." The door to room 402 swung open with a violent lack of ceremony. Park Min-ho, the syndicate's underboss, stepped into the room. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold ambition. He didn't look like a man visiting a dying mentor. He looked like a landlord inspecting a property he had finally foreclosed on. He ignored Maya as if she were merely another piece of medical equipment, walking straight to the bedside where Seok-Hyun lay. Inside the dark vault of his mind, Seok-Hyun went rigid. The warmth of Amara's hand was gone, replaced by the predatory chill of Min-ho's presence. He felt the bed creak as the traitor leaned over him. "Look at you," Min-ho sneered, his voice dripping with a casual, terrifying cruelty. "The great tiger of Guro-gu reduced to a leaky faucet. Do you know how long I waited for you to slip? 10 years of bowing, 10 years of playing the loyal dog while you built your monuments." He reached out and tapped the glass of the heart monitor with a gold-ringed finger. The sharp clack-clack sounded like a hammer on a coffin lid. "The board signed the papers an hour ago, Seok-Hyun. In 48 hours, I pull the plug, and the empire officially changes hands. I've already moved the Incheon shipments to my private docks. By the time your heart stops, there won't even be a memory of you left in the ledger." Seok-Hyun's rage was a white-hot coal in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to reach up and wrap his fingers around Min-ho's throat, to tear the smirk off that traitorous face. But he remained a statue of pale flesh and silence. He listened as Min-ho detailed the purge, the names of loyal captains who would be executed by dawn, the offshore accounts he intended to drain, and the brutal new order that would begin the moment the flatline echoed. "You were too soft at the end," Min-ho whispered, leaning closer until his breath fanned Seok-Hyun's cheek. "You started looking for a legacy. I'm looking for a reign." In the closet, Amara watched through the thin slat of the door, her small hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed her years. She saw the man she had anchored to life being mocked by a wolf in a suit. Behind her, Maya stood trembling, her hand resting on a heavy industrial glass cleaner bottle, the only weapon she had. Min-ho laughed, a dry, hollow sound, and turned on his heel. "Enjoy the silence, boss. It's all you have left." The door slammed shut, the vibration rattling the IV poles. For a long minute, the room returned to its mechanical hum. Then, the closet door creaked open. Amara didn't wait for her mother. She ran to the bed and seized Seok-Hyun's hand again, her warmth flooding back into his system like a counterpoison. Seok-Hyun's mind was no longer drifting. It was a battlefield. He had 48 hours to stop a massacre, and the only soldiers he had were a terrified nurse's aide and a child who believed in miracles. He squeezed her hand, Not a twitch this time, but a deliberate, crushing pressure. "I'm awake," he signaled in the dark, "and I am going to burn his world to the ground." The silence that followed Minho's departure was thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic, shallow breaths of Maya as she stepped out from the shadows of the closet. Her hands were still shaking so violently that the industrial cleaner rattled against the cart. She looked at the man in the bed, the man who was supposed to be a corpse, and then at her daughter, who was once again anchored to his side. "We have to go, Amara," Maya whispered, her voice cracking with a terrifying realization of the world they had just glimpsed. "That man, he's going to hurt anyone near this bed. We can't be here." But Amara didn't move. Her small hands remained wrapped around Seok-Hyun's, her gaze fixed on his face. "Mama, look," she breathed. "He's trying to say something." Maya stepped closer, her instinct for self-preservation warring with a sudden, inexplicable pull toward the dying king. She looked down at Seok-Hyun's face, expecting the same frozen mask of the last 3 weeks. Instead, she saw the subtle, rhythmic flutter of his eyelids. It wasn't a seizure or a reflex. It was deliberate. Then came the pressure. Seok-Hyun's large, pale hand, the one Amara was holding, began to tap, 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 tap. It was a primitive, desperate code. Maya, who had spent her life navigating the unspoken languages of the marginalized and the ignored, felt the hair on her arms stand up. She reached out, placing her own trembling hand on his other wrist. "You're in there," she whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal of reality. "If you can hear me, blink twice." A beat of absolute silence passed. Then, slowly, painfully, Seok-Hyun's dark lashes swept down and up. Once, twice. Maya gasped, stumbling back into her cart. The machines were still screaming his death, the monitors still flatlining his soul, but the man was home. He was a prisoner in a crumbling fortress, sending out a flare. "I'm here," Seok-Hyun thought, the words a silent roar in his mind. He looked at Maya, not with his eyes, but with the raw intensity of his focus. He needed her to understand. He began a new rhythm, tapping his finger against Amara's palm in the pattern of a phone number he had memorized long ago. "He's counting," Amara whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. 1, 2, 3, 4. Maya realized then that she wasn't just a witness to a miracle. She was being recruited into a war. Every blink from Seok-Hyun was a command, every tap a coordinate. He was using the only tools he had left, the innocence of a child and the desperation of a mother, to rebuild his broken world. "The man who was just here," Maya said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone as she leaned over the bed. "He said 48 hours. He said everyone loyal to you is going to die." Seok-Hyun's eyes flew open for a fraction of a second, the dark irises burning with a lethal, silver-cold intelligence that nearly knocked Maya off her feet. It was the look of a tiger who had finally seen the bars of his cage. He blinked once, long and slow. A confirmation. "I don't know who to call," Maya whispered, her eyes darting to the door. "I'm just a nurse's aide. I have nothing." Seok-Hyun tapped again, more urgently this time, his finger tracing a shape on Amara's skin. A rectangle. A phone. He shifted his gaze toward the small, locked cabinet where the patient's personal effects were supposed to be kept, then back to Maya. He didn't need her to be a soldier. He needed her to be his ghost. As Amara hummed a soft, shaky tune to keep him tethered, Maya looked at the fallen king and saw the flicker of a rain that refused to end. The silent language had been spoken. The alliance of the invisible was formed. The midnight air outside Metropolitan Medical Center was thick with a humid, oppressive fog that seemed to swallow the streetlights. Maya stood by the employee entrance, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her scrub jacket to hide their trembling. Beside her, Amara sat on a plastic crate, her large, expressive eyes fixed on the entrance to the parking garage. The plan was madness, a desperate gamble whispered in the dark of room 402, but the alternative was watching the only man who had seen them be extinguished like a spent candle. "He's here," Amara whispered, her small voice cutting through the damp silence. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows rolled into the VIP lot, the tires crunching over the gravel like bone. Park Min-ho stepped out, adjusting the lapels of a coat that cost more than Maya made in a year. He didn't look at the night shift workers or the shadows. He walked with the arrogant stride of a man who already owned the building. As the elevator doors hissed shut behind him, Maya knew the clock had started. Seok-Hyun had signaled that the black box, a secure, encrypted drive containing the names of the loyalists, and the proof of the coup, was kept in the vehicle's hidden console. "Stay here, baby. If you see anyone, press the button on the radio," Maya instructed, handing her daughter a small walkie-talkie. Maya slipped into the garage, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the oil-stained concrete. The SUV sat like a predator in the dark. Seok-Hyun had blinked out the code for the secondary keyless entry, a fail-safe he had built into the fleet years ago. Maya reached the driver's side, her breath hitching as she held a small magnetic bypass device she had retrieved from the supply room, following Seok-Hyun's tapped instructions. The lights of the SUV flashed once, a silent wink in the gloom. The lock clicked. Inside, the car smelled of expensive leather and the same cloying cologne Minho had worn when he mocked his dying boss. Maya scrambled into the passenger seat, her fingers frantic as she felt beneath the center console for the recessed latch Seok-Hyun had described through his taps on Amara's palm. Her nails caught on a hidden seam, and a small drawer slid open with a mechanical hum. There it was, a heavy, matte black drive embossed with the Syndicate's tiger crest. Suddenly, the garage echoed with the heavy thud of a door. Maya froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Voices, men's voices, rough and laughing, approached from the stairwell. She looked at the dashboard. The digital clock blinked 12:14 a.m. Minho was supposed to be upstairs for at least 20 minutes, but his guards were returning early. "Mama, someone's coming," the walkie-talkie crackled, the static sounding like a scream in the quiet cabin. Maya didn't think. She snatched the drive, slammed the hidden drawer shut, and rolled out of the car, staying low to the ground. She scrambled beneath the belly of a neighboring van just as the guards rounded the corner, the beam of a flashlight dancing across the very spot where she had been standing seconds before. She pressed her face into the cold concrete, the scent of gasoline filling her lungs, clutching the black box to her chest. The guards lingered, lighting cigarettes and talking about the party that would happen once the plug was pulled in 36 hours. Maya waited, her eyes burning with unshed tears of terror, until they finally moved toward the elevator. She didn't wait for the silence to settle. She bolted, staying in the shadows until she reached the crate where Amara was waiting. She grabbed her daughter's hand, the cold metal of the drive heavy in her pocket. They had the evidence. They had the names. But as Maya looked up at the glowing windows of the ICU, she realized that stealing the secrets was the easy part. The hard part was getting them back to the king before the wolves realized their collar had been cut. The 48-hour clock didn't just wind down. It seemed to leach the very color from the walls of room 402. As the final morning arrived, the atmosphere in the ICU shifted from medical vigilance to a cold, bureaucratic finality. The senior neurological board had made their rounds, their faces set in the grim masks of men who had already moved on to the next case. For them, Jang Seok-Hyun was a ledger entry being closed. But for Maya, clutching the black box in her pocket, and Amara, who hadn't left the bedside for hours, the air was thick with the scent of an impending execution. The heavy doors swung open, and the cleanup crew arrived. It wasn't just the doctors. Minho was there, flanked by 2 lawyers in razor-sharp suits and a pair of guards whose hands rested too close to their waistbands. They moved with a predatory efficiency, surrounding the bed like vultures settling onto a branch. "It's time," the head doctor said, his voice devoid of resonance. He reached for the primary power cable of the ventilator, his hand steady and clinical. "On behalf of the family and the healthcare proxy, we are beginning the cessation of life support measures." Before his fingers could touch the cord, a small, fierce shadow darted forward. Amara didn't scream. She didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, she climbed onto the foot of the high hospital bed and scrambled up until she was draped over Seok-Hyun's chest. She wrapped her small, deep brown arms around his neck and seized his large hand with a grip that turned her knuckles white. "No," she said, her voice a low, vibrating bell in the sterile room. "He's still here. I can feel him." The room went deathly still. Minho stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of disgusted impatience. "Get this child out of here," he barked at Maya. "Now, we have a schedule to keep." Maya felt the familiar, paralyzing weight of fear, the urge to stay invisible, to bow her head and obey. But then she looked at Seok-Hyun. Beneath the covers, she saw his eyes darting frantically under his lids. She saw the minute, rhythmic tapping of his finger against Amara's palm. He was screaming for time. Maya stepped between Minho and the bed, her frame small but unyielding. "She isn't moving," Maya said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "And neither am I, according to hospital policy. If there is a dispute regarding the patient's responsiveness, you are required to perform a final reflexive stimulus test. You haven't done it today." "This is a joke," Minho hissed, taking a menacing step toward Maya. "He's a vegetable. Move, or I'll have the guards move you." Amara didn't flinch. She pressed her cheek against Seok-Hyun's pale, cold face, her warmth acting as a living shield. "He's awake," she whispered into his ear. Tell them now." In the lightless vault of his mind, Seok-Hyun felt the pressure of the girl's embrace. It was the only thing holding him to the earth as the shadows tried to pull him under. He gathered every fragment of his soul, every ounce of the rage and the love that had been ignited by a stranger's touch. He didn't just twitch, he fought the very laws of biology. As the doctor reached again for the plug, Seok-Hyun's hand, the one Amara held, didn't just tap. It surged upward, his fingers locking around the girl's hand in a crushing, undeniable grip. His eyes snapped open, two shards of silver-cold ice burning with a lethal lucidity that sent the doctor stumbling back. The king had returned to his throne, and the executioners were suddenly the ones facing a death sentence. The atmosphere in room 402 shattered like ice under a hammer. As Seok-Hyun's fingers crushed Amara's hand in a grip that defied every medical chart, the room fell into a vacuum of stunned horror. The doctor stumbled back, the ventilator cable slipping from his nerveless fingers. Minho froze, his face draining of its arrogant color until he looked as ghostly as the man he had come to kill. Seok-Hyun didn't just open his eyes, he reclaimed them. The silver-cold stare that had once commanded the docks of Incheon and the boardrooms of Manhattan burned through the sterile haze. With a guttural, terrifying rasp, the sound of a machine starting after a lifetime of rust, he drew a single, deep breath. He didn't look at the doctors or the lawyers. His gaze locked onto Minho with a lethality that made the underboss instinctively reach for a weapon he wasn't allowed to carry in the ICU. "Did you think?" "I wasn't listening." Seok-Hyun's voice was a jagged blade, low and vibrating with a power that shouldn't have been possible for a man whose heart had supposedly quit. Minho's shock curdled into a desperate, panicked rage. He lunged forward, his hands reaching for the oxygen line, his eyes wild. "It doesn't matter, you're a ghost. I've already taken it all. The shipments, the accounts, it's mine by law." Seok-Hyun didn't flinch. He didn't even try to sit up. He simply looked at Maya, who stood trembling but resolute at the foot of the bed. "The drive," he croaked. Maya pulled the matte black box from her pocket. She didn't look at the guards or the lawyers. She looked only at the man who had signaled her in the dark. With a steady hand, she held it up for the room to see. "The Incheon shipments didn't go to your docks, Minho," Seok-Hyun whispered, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his cracked lips. "They were rerouted to a blind trust 10 minutes ago. While you were busy signing my death warrant, I was using the access codes you so kindly confirmed in your confession last night to move every cent out of the syndicate's reach." The underboss's phone began to vibrate in his pocket, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that signaled the collapse of his world. One by one, the lawyers and the guards stepped away from him. They were men of business, and Minho was no longer a viable investment. "I moved the billions into a foundation," Seok-Hyun continued, his grip on Amara's hand softening into a protective embrace. "A legacy, you called it. It's a legacy that has already paid for the silence of your captains and the loyalty of the men currently waiting for you in the lobby. You came here to pull a plug, Minho, but you're the one who's been disconnected." Minho let out a strangled cry, but before he could move, the hospital doors burst open. It wasn't the police. It was the old guard, the captains who had seen the data Maya had helped transmit, their faces set in grim loyalty to the man who had actually survived the winter. As they dragged the screaming traitor from the room, the mechanical hum of the ICU returned, but the cold was gone. Seok-Hyun turned his head slowly toward Amara. The silver fire in his eyes softened into something warm and human, a look he had never given another living soul. "You kept me warm," he breathed, his voice finally breaking. "Now I'll keep you safe." The king was back, but the empire he intended to rule was no longer built of blood and bullets. It was built on the weight of a child's hand. 6 months had passed since the sterile blue light of room 402 was traded for the golden glow of a late summer afternoon. The heavy scent of antiseptic and fear had been replaced by the smell of drying earth and fresh cedar. Jang Seok-Hyun stood in the shadow of a sprawling brick building in the heart of the city, a place that didn't house a syndicate or a vault, but a state-of-the-art youth center and a sanctuary for families who had been silenced by the world. Seok-Hyun moved with a slight limp, a permanent souvenir of the bullets that had nearly claimed him, but his frame had regained its solid, imposing strength. He no longer wore the plain hospital gown of a fallen king. He wore a soft linen shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars on his forearms. Beside him stood Maya, her face free of the exhausted shadows that had once defined her. She was no longer a ghost in the corridor. She was the director of a foundation that had already pulled 100 families out of the same darkness she once inhabited. "The board of directors called this morning," Maya said, her voice steady and full of a quiet, hard-won peace. "The pediatric wing is fully funded. We're starting the literacy program next week." Seok-Hyun looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting an admiration that went deeper than words. He had dismantled an empire of blood, brick by brick, and used the rubble to build a legacy that could actually breathe. He had learned a new language, not of codes and threats, but of responsibility and hope. "It's not enough," Seok-Hyun murmured, though he was smiling. "We're just getting started." From the entrance of the new center, a high-pitched laugh rang out. Amara came running toward them, her coiling curls bouncing in the sunlight. She was no longer a child hiding in closets or whispering to a dying stranger. She was the spark that had started a fire, and she knew it. She was carrying a small bucket of water and a cloth, but she dropped them as she reached a square of wet, gray cement near the building's cornerstone. "Mama, Seok-Hyun, it's time," she shouted, pointing at the smooth surface. "We have to leave our mark before it gets hard." The three of them knelt together on the edge of the sidewalk. The world around them was busy with the sounds of a neighborhood coming back to life, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of children in the nearby park. In the middle of it all, they were a family that no one could have predicted, bound by a thread that had started with a single touch in the dark. Amara went first. She pressed her small, deep brown hand into the center of the cement, her brow furrowed in concentration, just as it had been on the night she chose courage over finality. Then Maya placed her hand beside her daughter's, her fingers steady and strong. Finally, Seok-Hyun reached out. His large, broad hand, the hand that had once been cold enough to signify death, descended into the wet clay. He pressed down firmly, overlapping the edges of Maya's and Amara's prints. The contrast was beautiful, the deep brown, the warm tan, and the pale gold, all merging into a single, permanent record. As they stood up, wiping the dust from their clothes, they looked down at the three prints. They weren't just marks in concrete. They were a testament to the night the machines were wrong. Seok-Hyun reached out and took Amara's hand in his fingers wrapping protectively around hers. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the ICU, but the comfortable, shared peace of people who had survived the winter together. The fallen king had found his throne, and the little girl had saved a soul. Together, they turned away from the shadows and walked toward the light of the new order they had built.